Right, this is a brief summary of the age of reform in the early 1800s. When we think of reform, we're going to see some cycles of reform going out throughout U.S. history, and you can almost think of them as almost a boom and a bust kind of scale, right? So if you imagine that things go up and down throughout time, and on these inclines, we can think of reforms up here, and down here would be, you might say, status quo, no reform, very little reform. So when we're going up in this decline, usually there's a bunch of things that are causing anxiety in society. That there are times of uncertainty. These things lead people to think they need reform. There needs to be some answer, need to fix society or seek oftentimes religious answers to their problems. And then reform goes on for a little while, and eventually people become complacent in this period of complacency, and they eventually go back down to status quo. So we'll see this, and this happens over and over again. We go back up to reform, then back down. So we're going to look at these reform movements and what was going on in the United States at this particular time in the early 1800s. Maybe it's good to think about before we get too far that the what of this is what we're going to look at reforms, but who are the reformers during this particular time? And there's going to be a bunch of them. A lot of the major figureheads we're going to see are male, but we also see for social class, this is mostly a middle class group. You think about why that is. We have in America the working class. So now we think of the middle class as the people getting by paycheck to paycheck, blue collar workers. But at that time, that's the working class. So these are the working classes working in factories or on farms. The middle class are people that have some affluence, right? So these are, say, affluence, they have some money. They're not worrying about where the next paycheck's coming from. Although they're businessmen and women, and they need to make money, but they're not so much concerned about putting food on the table every day. So these are people of affluence. These are people that, because of this, have some leisure time. And with that leisure time, they're able to then dedicate their lives to reform. Now, there's men that are the leaders of a lot of these reformers, we'll see, but we'll see beyond the leaders, women play a vital role. And think about why that is. Women at this time in the middle class weren't expected to work. So we know that the cult of domesticity, which we'll talk about in a little bit, was the idea that women belonged in the home. And we saw that even with the factory girls that worked at Lowell, they would go to work when they were young. But once they got married, the expectation was they would go back into the home. So women are going to play a big role in this reform movement because they have leisure time, their families have affluence. And the other thing about this is that they can't participate, they can't vote, they can't participate in politics. So if they want to express their opinions or change the world, they can't do it at the ballot box. So they have to do it through reform movements instead and become an active members in those. So we think about how this all comes about and the context for it. We think about contextualization, right? What things led up to this. Well, a big thing for this would be the industrialization of the United States as a major one. So the United States, although we don't really hit our major industrial revolution until after the Civil War, we start seeing the beginning of it in the Northeast, in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, and other manufacturing towns. And we know from our study of the Industrial Revolution that usually brings this low wages, not great jobs, unsafe jobs, long hours. Usually, poverty follows it. People living in bad tenements in urban areas. So industrialization, think about that. This is going to cause changes in society. It's going to have people, working more for wages than for themselves. In the age of farming, prior to this industrial period, every man, in a sense, saw the fruits of their labor. If they worked hard, they had more food, they produced more farm goods, and they were better off. But in the age of industrialization, it doesn't matter how hard you work, you're working for a wage and per hour. In addition to that, I think of industrialization also causes the changing of the landscape. Things, trees being cut down, smoke in the air. So that's going to cause a lot of people to question the world they live in. So here's one thing that's going to cause a need for people or a reason why there's some anxiety and uncertainty in America that will lead to reform. Another thing we talked about was a market revolution. You think about that, all of a sudden the world is interconnected in the way it wasn't before. That changes some of the jobs for women. Women's roles change as a result of that. Social classes change. There's more rich and there's more poor. There's a bigger growing gap between the two. Women are leaving the home more to work in these factories that are providing, the textiles to be sent around the country. And kind of going along with this, that's related to the market revolution would be the transportation and the communication revolution. These change the world in a way I think is tough for us to really wrap our minds around. But in a world where prior to the transportation revolution, living in Western New York, like we talked about earlier, is a world away. You might as well not even consider going out there to visit, or if you moved out there, you're not really coming home. But now the world seems smaller. People travel around more. People from different regions of the country go and visit or migrate to other parts of the country, which brings different values and different ways of looking at things. Same thing with communication. Ideas spread more. So if you're living in a really rural part of, like, say, New Hampshire, and all of a sudden transportation becomes easier, you start having some urban people or people from other states come in and move into your area, and maybe you're concerned that's going to change the moral character of your area. So that causes a lot of uncertainty. About westward expansion starts to really kick off during this time, and that causes anxiety and uncertainty. If you're living in one of those New England states or the eastern states, people are just packing up and leaving. So what's that mean for your state if you're losing population? It means you might lose votes in the House of Representatives. Maybe there's less people to do the work, especially if the people moving west are the low-wage workers. So who's going to fill those low-wage jobs if everybody's going west for opportunity and land? Tied to this is immigration. There's big waves of immigration during this time. So people are worried that these immigrants are going to have different values, different religions, speak a different language, different customs, and it's going to change what it means to be an American. And we know the nativist groups form because of that. Then the last thing we'd say is this idea of more democracy. We know that during the age of Andrew Jackson, more white men could vote, pretty much regardless of property requirements or taxes, or a minimal amount of taxes. So with more white men voting, that meant more uneducated people voting, and a lot of people feared that meant that the republic might be in danger because it was being turned increasingly over to decision-making for voting was being increasingly turned over to less qualified individuals. So all these things add up to the idea that there's going to be uncertainty in America and anxiety about society and America's future. And people start looking for answers, so when that happens, they turn to, oftentimes we'll see religion. So the catalyst to reform is the Second Great Awakening. And there's a lot of reasons for this. This built up anxiety and uncertainty in society is certainly one of them, but other things that lead to this, the Second Great Awakening was people have been turning away from religion. They've been looking more to rationalism, especially during the age of the Federalists in their, the Revolution, the Constitution, looking for enlightened ideas rather than turning to religion. So some people started to fear that religion was being weakened, and they started to revive it. One of the guys that's best known for it here's a picture of him, Charles Finney. Charles Grandison Finney, one of the Second Great Awakening preachers in upstate New York. So this is Charles Finney. And what we see with a lot of these Second Great Awakening preachers is an appeal to emotionalism. So we could say we have emotionalism in these sermons. We have the idea of free agency, meaning that the old Calvinist idea of predestination wasn't super popular amongst a lot of people, but the idea of free agency was appealing, that I have some impact on my salvation. If I am a good person and I make good decisions, then I'll go to heaven, and if I don't, then I won't. So people that are bad are going to get their just desserts in the end and go to the hot place, and people that are good will go to heaven, as opposed to predestination, where it didn't really matter what you did. So there was a whole lot of comfort in that if you were convinced that you were saved or one of the elect. So this idea of free agency also kind of goes along with the idea of democracy too, that if we as people have more say in what goes on in our government, shouldn't we have more say in our salvation too? So we have a lot of emotionalism in this idea of free agency. Charles Finney, we know, was big in the upper state New York area, what they call the burnt over district. And one of the reasons you can imagine for that would be that I don't have a map of New York, but let's draw a rough map of New York. It's a terrible map of New York, but say this is New York City down here. Let's say this is roughly Albany. And this is Buffalo. We know from our study that what they built along this area was the Erie Canal, so it connected the Hudson River that goes north, and they built the Erie Canal to go out to Buffalo. And you think about along this line of the Erie Canal, this is a very rural area, not very densely populated in all those areas upstate New York. And as more goods are transported along the Erie Canal back and forth, towns are going to pop up, hotels are going to pop up, taverns are going to pop up, new people are going to migrate there, and people start questioning the world they're in. This was a place that was ripe for a revival, looking for some answers, and Charles Finney was there to provide them. Very emotional sermons. They called it the Burnt Over District because it was on fire with the fires of revivalism. You also have other people that there's a bunch of them. Timothy Dwight's one of them. Another one that's particularly important is Peter Cartwright, and maybe more important, not so much because of him, but because of what he or where he was a preacher. He was a frontier preacher, what they called itinerant preachers. So he traveled around from the western frontier town to, or not even towns really, settlement to settlement, and he was a frontier preacher. And they would almost have these impromptu revivals that would last several days. They'd have little stages that they'd put together, and they'd have these big giant camp meetings. So let's see, we get a picture of one of those. This picture of one of these big camp meetings. And you can see he's up on the stage there giving his sermons. There's people on the ground that are falling all over the place. Very emotional. People that had, you think about people on the frontier, didn't have established churches. Many of them had, been living common law marriages, but didn't have a church or a preacher to actually marry them. So they were really hungry for some religion. And these revivals provided them. An interesting account of one of them is here. Take a look at the description of a Kentucky revival. Under such exhortations, the people began to be affected in a very strange manner. At first, they were taken with inward throbbing of the heart, and then with weeping and trembling, and from that crying out in an apparent agony of soul, falling down and swooning away till every appearance of animal life was suspended, and the person to be in a trance. So these people they're all worked up. They're feeling that their souls are being saved. They're in trances. They're falling down. They're fainting. They're crying out. Some people contracted the jerks, went into like body convulsions. Some laughed the holy laugh, and I don't know what the holy laugh is, but I don't want to hear it. They babbled in unknown tongues, and they got down on their hands and knees and barked like dogs at the devil. So you get a sense that these people are really worked up about this emotionally, and they're swept up in the fever of revival. The meeting continued for 5 days and 4 nights, and the people generally scattered from the ground. Numbers convened in different places and continued to exercise much longer. And even where they were not collected together, these wonderful operations continued among every class of people. So since this is an equalizing event, right? It's not rich or poor. Everybody, if you're a sinner, you have to come to God the same way with your hands open, asking for forgiveness. So every class of people in every situation, in their houses and fields and their daily employments, falling down and crying out under conviction, or singing and shouting with unspeakable joy, were so common that the whole country around seemed to be leavened with the spirit of the work. So you get a sense from these that these are major events. Let me get that out of the way. I'll get all my highlights. These are major social events. They're cultural events. People gather together, especially in their frontier where they're living out in the wilderness, and they probably don't see too many other people. So this is one of the few times they get together with other people, and it brings some kind of cultural sense of unity. And you think about when we talk about the Great Awakening, why this is a catalyst to reform. So we get the idea of a catalyst here, right? That a catalyst speeds things up. Well, go back to that idea of the ups and downs, right? There was all this anxiety, all these things causing anxiety in society that we just talked about, the context. It's going to lead to this reform movement at the top of this little bubble. And you might say the Second Great Awakening sped things up. It made this maybe a steeper incline or a steeper movement to reform than it might have been before. And why is that? Because a lot of these people that were moved by the Second Great Awakening started thinking about their salvation, started to say, well, I can't just work for my salvation. These ideas need to be applied to other people. Society must be more Christian-like. Society needs to reflect Christian goals. In a sense, we must bring the kingdom of God to earth. I shouldn't say Christian goals, but Christian values. So a lot of these people felt that way, and they said, well, now that I've worked towards my salvation, how can I bring the kingdom of heaven to earth? How can I make society better? And a lot of ways that they do this. So we think about, you can almost think about the Second Great Awakening here in the middle. Second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening. This is our catalyst, and it leads to all these different reform movements. You think about some of them, like the temperance movement. Temperance movement, the move to limit or completely abolish the consumption and production of alcohol. You have a bunch of groups here, like the American Temperance Society, the Washingtonians, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Lyman Beecher is a big person in this movement. Here's a picture of Lyman Beecher, one of the preachers. He's also an abolitionist, also Second Great Awakening preacher, but he's a big person in the temperance movement. And the idea behind temperance was that the reason why they wanted to limit or completely stop the consumption of alcohol was because people were not becoming good members of society. They were drinking too much. They'd go home from work, get their pay, go to a tavern, drink it all the way, not be able to save money for the family, provide food. Fathers were getting drunk and staying in taverns, therefore they're absentee fathers. They might come home and be more physically abusive to their wives because they were drunk. You'd have the idea they're not going to be good productive workers if they're drunk or hungover. They're not going to be able to participate in democracy because they'll be drunk and not be able to make good decisions. So all these things led to the temperance movement, right? And this is the idea of the Second Great Awakening, needing to make society better. So here's an evil of society, the consumption of alcohol. And this picture kind of shows it. Here, the drunkard's progress. So you can see this in here, that this kind of political cartoon of the day shows that, let's see, you see down here in this area to the left there, let me go to, actually a point, it might be better. If we go to this area over here, it shows the progress of someone that drinks as they go from drinking to becoming a full-fledged drunk. And step number one is a glass with a friend. And you see a person just having a casual drink after work. Step number two is a glass to keep the cold out. Step three is a drink too much, and you see at this point, this gentleman is now a little bit more drunk. He's slacking down. And then as they go through this, you see these people are fighting over here because they get drunk. Now we have the thing he calls it the happy drunkard. I can't quite read things. Something along the lines of the happy drunkard. Basically, they're just sitting there, wasting the day away, spending all their money, drinking, and not going home. But then, as they reach the climax of the circle, now they go into the decline, and see that it brings on poverty. It brings on loss of friends and family. It brings on desperation, and then in the end, death and suicide. So as people drink too much, eventually they're going to end up down at the bottom in the very at the dismal end. And down here at the bottom, you see the mother and the child who are sad because the husband's gone. If he's already gotten to the last stage, or he squandered the money, and they're the ones left, without anything. So this is one of the reasons why there was such a movement against drinking at the time. Think of other reform movements that come from this. Well, if we're going to make life better for ourselves with Christian salvation, there's the asylum and the prison reform movement. And some of this is based on the idea. We know Dorothea Dix is one of our reformers, and she looks at people living in prisons or being stuck in prisons. Here's Dorothea Dix. Over here. Sees a lot of mentally ill people are just put in jails and not getting any treatment for it, treated like criminals. So she says, we got to fix that. So they started the movement for mental institutions. And by today's standards, their mental institutions were pretty terrible, but it was different than being put in jail. Prison reform. People started looking at prisoners and saying, well, if we're going to put them in prison, we can't just put them away and lock the key. That's going to be worse when they come out, if they come out at all. So some people said we need to have more reform for prisons. So, again, ironically, one of the ways they came up with fixing prisons was to have solitary confinement. So prisoners would sit alone and reflect upon their sins and what they did wrong and come out better people. And it didn't work so well. Even if you look at old prisons, the only windows were really high up, not so much, I guess it helped prevent escaping too, but if they wanted to see the sun, they had to look up towards God. And you even see a lot of times some of these are prisons from this time that were designed in a crucifix shape. So this would be like a center area, and then the prisons would be, the jails would be over here, the cells. But even like the layout of it is supposed to represent Christian thinking. And again, by today's standards, they probably weren't. They weren't great. But the idea is we need to reform it, get prisoners to sit there and become better people rather than just be locked away forever. So Dorothea Dix is instrumental in the prison reform movement. We have other reform movements. Education. We have people like Horace Mann starts talking about education, having common schools supported by tax dollars, compulsory schools. Here's a picture of Horace Mann. So we think compulsory education, you have to go, and it's free because the state's going to pay for it. Massachusetts led the way, and we know that New England, all the way back to the colonial days, was always better about education than some of the other areas because they wanted kids to learn their Bible, learn moral lessons, and this isn't a whole lot different. They certainly taught literacy. They taught morality. They had kids who read McGruffy's Readers, which would be full of moral lessons, but they were Protestant moral lessons, so Catholics didn't like it so much. So we start seeing Catholic schools develop private schools at that time. But the idea behind education, at least primary education, was that everyone should pitch in, because if we have an uneducated population, then it's going to be a drain on the rest of society. So even if we don't have kids in the school, we all have an interest in an educated population so they can make better decisions as adults, get better jobs, not be kind of the wandering vagabonds without jobs. They can vote and better participate in democracy. So Horace Mann led the Common School initiative. And we also see that there's changes in higher education too, more colleges, especially out west, are built, more public colleges. Prior to this, a lot of the colleges were private schools like Dartmouth, Yale, and Princeton, and Harvard. But now we start seeing more public institutions. In addition, we see the first schools admit women, Mount Holyoke and Oberlin College, allowing women to get a higher education, which was very rare at the time. So we have changes in education. We have, you can think about suffrage is another big one. Women's suffrage, or why don't we put women's rights, because suffrage is part of that, but it's not all of it. Women's rights. So we see with the women's rights movement, there's a couple key players in that. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one. There's a picture of her in her younger days, early 1800s. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a big advocate for women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton goes to, she marries Henry Stanton, who is an abolitionist, and they go to London to an abolitionist meeting. So she's really into the stopping of slavery. And at the abolitionist meeting in London, she's not allowed to sit with the men. She has to go to her own little roped-off section with women. That's you can't really hear any speakers. And she realizes how bad women had it. When she's there, she meets Lucretia Mott, another abolitionist, both an abolitionist and a suffragette, someone that wanted women to have votes. So they work in the early 1800s to get women the right to vote. We see the big meeting of this at the Seneca Falls Convention. So there's a drawing of them at the Seneca Falls Convention. Seneca Falls. Where women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony started to put together what they called the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments for Women. And it was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. And it said things like all men and women are created equal, that there's certain rights that women have. They talked about things like women having a right to property, that at this time still a lot of states had laws that women didn't own property. Whatever, even the clothes on their back technically belonged to the men. And they were, in a sense, revolting against, or not, revolting might be too strong a word, but they were reacting against and trying to change the dominant mentality of the day called the cult of domesticity. And as you read about in the book, the cult of domesticity was basically the idea that a woman's place was in the home, that she was the moral guardian of the home, that men were out at work all day and the world of business was cutthroat, and the home needed to be a sanctuary. So the cult of domesticity was the idea that women needed to be at home, and sometimes they call this, gives you really a sense of the mentality, the cult of true womanhood. And again, the idea behind this is that you're in the home and your job is to clean the home, raise the kids, educate the kids in morals until they go to school, cook, things like that, make the home a nurturing place. If that's the cult of true womanhood, then if you don't do that, if you disagree, then essentially they're saying by default, you're not a true woman. So this is the mentality of the day, and people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott, amongst others, wanted to rebel against that. They don't win the right to vote. They're very instrumental in the abolitionist movement, and what we'll find is that the anti-slavery movement that during this time becomes such a dominant moral issue that a lot of some of these other ones like temperance and women's rights somewhat take a almost like a timeout for a while to deal with that. But we have a lot of people starting to think about women's rights for the first time. The Grimke sisters are another couple that went around, Angela and Sarah Grimke. They dedicate themselves to abolition and women's rights. And then the other big one during this time, of course, is wrong color. The other one, big one during this time, is the anti-slavery movement. And this becomes, remember we talked about the Missouri Compromise in 1820. There was questions about whether or not the country should allow Missouri to become a slave state, and should we add Maine, all these other things. What notably was missing in that debate about Missouri and statehood and slavery was the morality of slavery. It was all about political power in Congress, whether or not the South would have as many Senate votes as the North, or more or less. But nobody really was bringing up the issue of slavery, this peculiar institution. But we're starting seeing with the Second Great Awakening, a lot of that mentality's changed. People are starting to say that slavery is a moral issue. It's a moral abomination, and it has to be ended. That if slavery is right and America is slavery, then there's something wrong with America. So we start seeing an increasing movement towards people saying that this is a moral wrong. Some of our big people in this are William Lloyd Garrison. There's a picture of William Lloyd Garrison, and he's famous for being someone that wants immediate emancipation. There was different varieties of abolitionists, we should note, right? Some people wanted to take any African Americans who were free and have them go and they started a colony in Africa called Liberia, and the idea was that free African Americans could go to Liberia, back to Africa. And think about that, that kind of tells you that some of the people there thought slavery was wrong, but they were definitely still racist. They didn't want African Americans then competing with them for jobs or living in the neighborhoods. They wanted them free from slavery, but they didn't want them in America. But there's other people that, like William Lloyd Garrison, who was a very radical abolitionist. He wrote the paper The Liberator, and he wanted immediate emancipation for slaves with no compensation to owners and no questions asked. So here's a famous quote from him, from one of his famous writings from The Liberator. Let's see. I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but there is not a cause for severity. I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation, right? So it says there's no time for moderation. Like, we can't think of slavery and abolishing it as a moderate issue. No. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. So he's saying, look, these are all things. Would you tell someone whose house is on fire to be moderately alarmed? Would you tell a man whose wife is being ravished to moderately rescue her? No. It says, so tell these people, it says, if you're going to tell me to be moderate, tell them to be moderate. It says, but urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. So William Lloyd Garrison looked at this as saying, this is one of the big issues of the day. This has to be dealt with. This can't be gradually done away with. It can't be, we can't, just send free African Americans back to Africa, and we certainly can't continue to look the other way. Like, a lot of Northerners prior to this era would say, well, I think slavery is wrong, but it's not my job to tell somebody down in the South how to live their life. But now with things like William Lloyd Garrison talking about the morality of slavery, people start saying, well, maybe it is wrong. Maybe it's wrong all the time. And instrumental in that, even more so than William Lloyd Garrison, would be the work of people like Frederick Douglass, who we talked about prior to this, that escaped slavery and gave his account of how awful it indeed was. And people like Harriet Tubman, who ran the Underground Railroad and helped slaves escape, and as more and more slaves escaped to the North and told their stories, it became more and more apparent that this was not something that was compromisable anymore. So abolitionism grows, and this is going to be huge because when we look at the Civil War, we could say as we get closer to it in the mid 1800s, why did America change? They were willing to compromise on slavery during the Missouri Compromise, but why not later? And part of it's because it's become now a moral issue that people are unwilling to accept it as existing anywhere in the United States. So these are all big reform movements. This is a huge time, and it's all because of, not all because, but it's sparked by the Second Great Awakening, right? This kind of gives people the moral, you might say, the moral sense that things need to change either through alcohol or asylums, education, women's rights, anti-slavery movement. What's interesting about this time, just to end on this, is the thing about, so these are all connected to the Second Great Awakening. You might also think that these are all products of all that anxiety in society and the uncertainty that we talked about. So maybe I was writing off the thing. Uncertainty. So some people look to solve that uncertainty through religion, and through religion then out to these reform movements that they had. Other people look to deal with that anxiety by, we might say, almost a separate group entirely, utopian communities. So I'm not going to connect this to the Great Awakening. Utopian societies. These are people that wanted to, in a sense, separate. They thought maybe the world, they definitely felt the uncertainty and the pressure there from all these changes in America, but they weren't looking to reform society. In a sense, they were looking to escape society, to form their own utopian perfect communities. And think about some of the groups that are here. This is like the Shakers, this religious group that wanted to live communally, share property. They believed in complete separation of the gender, so they didn't even have marriage or sexual relations, so they didn't reproduce. They could only increase numbers of Shakers through converting people or getting new people to join the Shakers. So it's a group that, and they live separately. They live very back to basics. They don't believe in industrialization, made everything themselves. You have other groups like the Oneida community, one of these stranger groups in upstate New York, led by John Humphrey Noyes, who they believed, again, in communal living, but also believed in open marriages, that kids didn't belong to families, they belonged to the community, and they believed in the sense that in one of the first free love societies where people would, they could have sexual relations with anybody, not just their husbands and wives, and if they had kids, and the kids communally belonged to everybody. So that's kind of a strange group of people, but they were, they were escaping society and adopting, kind of like what they saw as the right way of doing things. New Harmony one, Robert Irwin, a socialist from England, comes over here and wants to bring a socialist utopia here by saying we can have an industrial society that doesn't have the problems of industrialism. And that's not a whole lot different, you think, than like what Francis Cabot Lowell did. But with the difference with Robert Irwin and New Harmony is that the workers would own part of the factory, land would be evenly split, there wouldn't be rich and the poor. And it's not to say that wasn't true. Like they did have worker-owned factories and communal land or cooperative land, but it didn't succeed because it lacked incentive. People that worked there first probably liked it, but then they realized, that if we're all going to be the same, then what's the point of working harder? And so you have groups like that. You have groups like the Fourier's Phalanxes, again, where they had communal collective ownership of land because he felt competition was what made life so terrible. And people, again, liked it at first, but, eventually they said, well, there needs to be some incentive for me to work harder. Brook Farm, another one that we'll see a little bit later on, Transcendentalist, where people could go and live communally and escape this cutthroat world of industrialization and westward expansion. Another group that kind of stands out too, is even somewhat separate from these two, maybe excluded not by choice though, was the Mormons. So the Mormons started their version of Christianity in the West with Joseph Smith. The idea that the lost tribe of Israel had come to America, and then now the Native Americans and the Israelites had somewhat they did intermingled. That there was a second coming of Christ that was going to be in America. So Joseph Smith started the Mormon religion, and it was not well liked by people in Illinois, and eventually he was killed. And Brigham Young led them west. But another idea of people, in a sense, separating rather than taking part in trying to make this society better over here with the Second Great Awakening. These are people that are trying to live separately, and because they saw society as going the wrong direction and beyond fixing, so they went to start their own utopias. And the Mormons went, we know, to Salt Lake, what they called the Deseret at the time, and started their own place to live. So this is the reform movements of the early 1800s, and these will be important because you see with these reform movements, certainly we're going to see great change eventually in things like prison reform, education, although we might not think compulsory education for up through secondary school is so great at the moment, but in the end, I think we could all agree that's good. Women's rights and the anti-slavery movement, and this will be the big one up here as we start getting closer to the Civil War. This is going to be the thing that's going to, as Thomas Jefferson called it, the fire bell in the night that awoke him with fear. Right, so that is the reform movements of the early 1800s.